There is a video of José Dinis Aveiro that exists somewhere in a television archive. His father, filmed years before his death, speaking with quiet pride about the son who would go on to become one of the greatest footballers who ever lived. Cristiano Ronaldo did not know this video existed. Not for years. Not until a television host slid it across a desk to him, live, on camera, and asked him to watch it. He had no idea what he was about to see. That single fact tells you something almost nobody expects about the man with more goals, more trophies, and more records than perhaps anyone in the history of the sport. The person who introduced him to football, the man whose surname he carries, was someone Cristiano Ronaldo would later admit he never really knew at all. To understand how a boy ends up not knowing his own father, and how that absence becomes, strangely, one of the engines behind a legendary career, you have to go back to a small football pitch on the island of Madeira, decades before anyone outside Portugal had heard the name Ronaldo. José Dinis Aveiro worked there as the kit man for a modest local club called Andorina, the person who washed jerseys, cleaned boots, and carried the equipment bags that belonged to other men's dreams. It was, by most measures, an unglamorous job. It came with no title, no recognition, and barely any pay. But it put his youngest son directly inside a football club before that boy could properly read, chasing a ball across a dusty pitch long before he understood what the sport could one day give him. Ronaldo has since called his father his first agent, the man who, whatever his flaws, made sure people came to watch his son play. That single detail is worth sitting with because it complicates everything that follows. The same man who opened the door to football for his son would spend the rest of his life struggling to walk through doors of his own. Before Dinis Aveiro was ever a kit man, he was a soldier. In his youth he was conscripted into Portugal's colonial war and sent to fight in Angola, a brutal, ultimately unsuccessful campaign that scarred an entire generation of young Portuguese men, sending them home to a country that rarely knew how to talk about what they had seen. He came home changed. According to accounts from his own family, the war left wounds that never fully closed. He began drinking, not occasionally. According to his wife Dolores, he was, in her words, drunk almost every day. This is where the story most people know about Ronaldo, the barefoot boy, the poverty, the hunger to succeed, collides with a story most people don't. Because growing up in that house didn't just mean going without money. It meant growing up next to a father who was physically present but, in almost every way that mattered, emotionally absent. "I never really knew him well," his mother would later admit. "I would have liked him to have been around more. Although he never mistreated his children, I became his victim." She wasn't speaking about violence. She was speaking about something quieter and, in its own way, more corrosive. Years spent as the only adult actually holding the family together, absorbing what her husband couldn't carry on his own. For young Cristiano, his father's condition came with its own particular cruelty. Other children mocked him for it. At Andorina, where his father worked, teammates would tease him about his father's drinking, about the humble job that had, ironically, given Ronaldo his very first taste of the sport. Rather than shrinking from that humiliation, something in him hardened around it. He has since said that the mockery made him want success even more, not just for himself, but to prove to everyone who had laughed that he was, in his own word, indestructible. The house he grew up in gave him almost nothing in the way of comfort. Money was tight enough that Ronaldo shared a single small room with his 3 older siblings for most of his childhood, and there were stretches when the family's meals were whatever could be stretched furthest. On the streets outside he played barefoot with other children, using rolled-up rags or whatever else passed for a ball when nobody could afford a real one. None of that hardship was unique to him. Plenty of modern families in that era lived the same way. What was unique was how early and how completely football became the one place where none of it seemed to matter. By 8 years old he was already showing the kind of speed and instinct that made grown men take notice, the kind of touch on a ball that made older boys stop what they were doing to watch. By 12, Sporting Clube de Portugal's academy in Lisbon wanted him enough to take him away from Madeira entirely. Away from his mother, his sisters, his brother, and yes, away from his father too. For a boy who had never left the island, it was terrifying. He has admitted he cried most nights from homesickness, mocked by other academy boys for his thick modern accent, thrown into a dormitory of strangers who had grown up with none of the same hardship he had. Most children in that position begged to go home. He stayed. It was inside that same academy, at 15, that his own body briefly threatened to end everything before it began. Doctors diagnosed him with a heart condition, tachycardia, a racing pulse that struck even at rest, serious enough that surgery was required. His mother remembers it with an almost eerie calm now. Doctors used a laser to correct the problem. He was operated on in the morning, and back out by the end of the afternoon. Within days he was training again. It was an early private rehearsal for a pattern that would define the rest of his life, his body trying to fail him, and him simply refusing to let it. By 18, that same academy prodigy had grown into something Manchester United was willing to pay a then-record transfer fee for a teenager to acquire. In the summer of 2003, Ronaldo left Lisbon for Manchester. Sir Alex Ferguson handed him the number 7 shirt, a jersey already carrying its own mythology at Old Trafford, worn before him by men whose names hung in the club's history. Photographers wanted his image. Journalists wanted his story. From the outside, everything about his life looked like ascension. What the cameras didn't capture was how deliberately United set out to break down parts of what they had just bought. According to former United goalkeeping coach Tony Coton, Ferguson had noticed a flaw in the 18-year-old almost immediately. Ronaldo went down too easily under contact, a habit that, in the physical world of English football at the time, would have been picked apart by defenders and mocked by pundits for the rest of his career. So Ferguson made it his mission, in Coton's words, to toughen the boy up. Coaching staff were quietly told to look the other way when senior players fouled Ronaldo hard in training. Men like Roy Keane gave him no mercy in 5-a-side games that were, by every account, brutally intense. Ronaldo would fall, protest, sit on the turf, muttering in Portuguese while play continued around him, and slowly, session by session, he learned to stay on his feet. It was an uncomfortable kind of care, delivered without warmth, entirely without conversation about why it was happening. In a strange way, it mirrored something he already knew from home, growing stronger not because someone explained the lesson to him gently, but because no one was going to make it easy, and he had already decided he would rather adapt than break. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in Madeira, his actual father's health was quietly collapsing. Dinis Aveiro's alcoholism had progressed into liver disease. The sun was rising into the brightest possible spotlight, learning to survive a different kind of toughening in a different country. The father, meanwhile, was fading in relative obscurity, a few hundred miles from the stage his son was walking onto. Less than a year after that transfer, in the summer of 2004, a 19-year-old Ronaldo stood on a football pitch in Lisbon, at a European Championship his own country was hosting, in the final against Greece. Portugal lost 1-0, to a team almost nobody had expected to win the tournament, and there, in front of a home crowd that had believed this would finally be the moment, Ronaldo cried, openly, on the pitch, in defeat, at 19 years old, on the biggest stage his country could offer him at the time. In the same year he had left home for a foreign league and a father he barely understood. It is worth remembering that moment clearly, because more than a decade later football would ask him to stand on almost the exact same kind of stage again, and something about it would be entirely different. But that difference was still years away. First came the harder blow. Ronaldo would later describe his relationship with his father in terms that are almost uncomfortably honest for a man rarely known for public vulnerability. "My father was an alcoholic," he said. "It wasn't the father I dreamed of having. I loved him, of course, but I never had a conversation with him as I am now having with you." Think about that sentence for a moment. A global icon, a man who has given thousands of interviews in dozens of languages, saying that he never once had an ordinary conversation with his own father. Not one. In September 2005, José Dinis Aveiro died in London, of liver failure, at 51 years old. Ronaldo was 20. He was 2 years into life at Manchester United, already a rising international star for Portugal. And on the day of his father's funeral, by multiple accounts, Cristiano Ronaldo did not attend. Instead, he played football that same evening. It is worth pausing on how strange, even harsh, that detail can sound out of context. A son choosing a pitch over a graveside. But grief rarely behaves the way outsiders expect it to. And for a young man who had spent his whole childhood learning to convert pain into performance, perhaps there was no other language available to him in that moment. Whatever the reason, one consequence of that period is clear and well documented. Ronaldo made a private vow after watching alcohol slowly dismantle his father that he would never touch it himself. By his own account and his mother's, he never has. That vow is the first thread of something larger. A pattern of extreme, almost obsessive self-denial that would come to define Ronaldo's entire adult life, long after the grief of 2005 had faded into public memory. Consider, years later at Manchester United, how teammates began describing him. Goalkeeper Ben Foster recalled arriving early to training only to find Ronaldo already finishing his routine, massages done, prehab and rehab already underway, hours before most players had even laced their boots. Striker Louis Saha once tried to simply match Ronaldo's personal schedule for a single morning. If the session started at 10, Saha arrived at 9 to prepare. Ronaldo, he discovered, had already been there since 8:30, resistance bands around his ankles, doing extra work nobody had asked him to do. "I couldn't keep up," Saha admitted. Former teammate Nicky Butt, in a passage later published in the book Viva Ronaldo, called it simply total dedication, total commitment, and total hard work. Not talent alone, but an almost punishing devotion to control, applied to every visible surface of his life. Teammates half-joked that he had become Ferguson's teacher's pet. They weren't entirely wrong. It just wasn't given to him. It was every single morning earned before anyone else had even arrived. That same instinct for control shows up in a detail so small most fans have never noticed it. In a sport where nearly every superstar's body is covered in tattoos, Ronaldo has none. Not one. The reason has nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with that same thread of discipline. "I don't have tattoos so that I can donate blood more often," he explained plainly in a 2012 interview. Because in most countries a fresh tattoo means months of ineligibility before you're allowed to give blood again. He has also donated bone marrow, a far more invasive process, after a Portugal teammate's young son was diagnosed with a serious illness. He has helped fund relief efforts after the earthquake in Nepal, and contributed toward building schools in Gaza. None of it required a camera crew, a press release, or a single mention in his own name at the time it happened. Much of it only became public years later, and only because someone else, a journalist, a teammate, a charity organizer, eventually mentioned it in passing. In 2009, Ronaldo left Manchester United for Real Madrid for a transfer fee that broke the world record at the time, a number that made headlines for its size, but that, in hindsight, tells you far less about him than the routine Ben Foster described years earlier still tells you. The fee measured his market value. It never measured the argument he was still quietly having with a man who wasn't there to hear it. It was in Spain that his career collided most directly with the one rivalry that would define an entire generation of the sport. For over a decade, in a league that suddenly felt too small to contain both of them, Ronaldo's Real Madrid and Lionel Messi's Barcelona traded blows in a competition so relentless it pushed each man to reinvent his own game almost every season just to stay ahead. Neither has ever pretended the two of them are close. "I'm not saying we're friends," Ronaldo said plainly years later. "I've never had dinner with him, but we're professional colleagues and we respect each other." Messi, for his part, has said much the same in his own words. Respect and admiration for a career that, in his telling, never needed exaggeration to be taken seriously. What the rivalry actually produced on the pitch was something closer to two men refusing to let the other define the ceiling of what was possible. Whatever else drove Ronaldo during those years, Messi's shadow across the same league, the same trophies, the same Ballon d'Or ceremonies, gave the argument he was already having with an absent father, an entirely new opponent to measure himself against, in full public view season after season. Line all of this up, and a shape starts to emerge that has almost nothing to do with football tactics or Ballon d'Or ceremonies. A boy raised by a father who couldn't control his own body grew into a man who built his entire adult identity around controlling his. A father who was absent in the ways that mattered most produced a son who shows up, obsessively, physically, for every single training session. First in, last out, year after year, club after club. It is not a coincidence. It reads, if you look closely enough, almost like a lifelong argument he has been having with a man who is no longer here to hear it. By the numbers alone, the argument has been won many times over. He has scored more goals in professional football than any player in recorded history. He is the only player to have won the Champions League with 3 different clubs. He has claimed 5 Ballon d'Or awards across 3 different teams in an era that also contained Messi, arguably the most demanding competitive environment the sport has ever produced. He has done this not for one club or one country, but across sporting, Manchester United, Real Madrid, Juventus, and the Portugal national team, spanning more than 2 decades at an elite level almost no other athlete has matched. What makes those numbers stranger still is how little they seem to have softened him. Teammates decades younger, arriving at clubs where Ronaldo was already a 2-time or 3-time Ballon d'Or winner, described the same thing Ben Foster and Louis Saha described years earlier at Manchester United. A man, in his 30s, then his 40s, still first to arrive, still doing extra repetitions nobody asked for, still behaving, in every visible respect, like someone with everything left to prove rather than everything already won. Trophies did not retire the argument. If anything, they seemed to make it louder, as though every additional record was less a celebration than another data point in a case being built for an audience of one who would never actually see the file. That refusal to stop proving himself extended year after year to the Portugal national team he had once wept for as a teenager. Long after most players his age had either retired from international duty or faded into supporting roles, Ronaldo kept showing up for his country across one World Cup cycle after another, still training like a man fighting to keep his place rather than a captain whose place had long been secure. It is worth remembering that every one of those tournaments carried, somewhere underneath the flags and anthems, the same quiet audience he had been performing for, since he was a boy kicking a ball outside a small clubhouse in Madeira. An audience of exactly one, who never bought a ticket, and never once got to watch from the stands. In 2010, 6 years before that emotional collision in Paris, Ronaldo became a father for the first time. He announced only that a son had been born, chose to keep the identity of the child's mother private, and took on sole custody from the very beginning, an unusual arrangement that drew scrutiny in the press, but which he has never fully explained. What is harder to overlook is how directly that moment sits next to everything the rest of his story had already built. A man who had spent his adult life turning an absent father into fuel for extreme discipline was now, suddenly, the only parent his own son had. Around that same period, reflecting on his own father, Ronaldo said something that cuts closer to the center of this story than almost anything else he has ever said publicly. "My father was always in good spirits. He loved football. It makes me a bit sad because if he could enjoy seeing me now, what I have achieved, that would be a highlight in his life. But I'm sure that he watches over me from above. It is one thing to build a career out of grief. It is another thing entirely to become, almost overnight, the exact kind of presence you spent your whole childhood missing. But none of those numbers explain what happened at the European Championship final in 2016. 11 years after his father's death, 31-year-old Ronaldo walked out as Portugal's captain at the Stade de France in Paris, against the host nation, in a European Championship final, the same competition in spirit where he had cried in defeat as a 19-year-old in Lisbon. This time, 25 minutes in, a hard tackle from France's Dimitri Payet left his knee too damaged to continue. He tried to play through it. He couldn't. He was carried off the pitch in tears, his hands covering his face, his tournament seemingly over before it had really begun a second time. What happened next is the part people still talk about. Rather than disappearing to the dressing room, Ronaldo spent the rest of the match, 90 minutes, then 30 more of extra time, on the touchline in a heavily bandaged knee, acting as an auxiliary coach. He gestured, he shouted instructions, he embraced teammates between plays, urging them on as though his own body hadn't just failed him in the biggest match of his international career. In the 109th minute, a substitute named Ader, a player who had struggled to score even a single goal in over a season in England, found the ball on the edge of the box and drove a shot low past the French goalkeeper. Portugal led. Portugal held on. Portugal won its first ever major international trophy, and Cristiano Ronaldo cried again. But this time it wasn't the collapse of a 19-year-old watching a home final slip away. It was a captain, unable to play, unable to control the outcome with his own feet for the first time in his career at this level. Lifting a trophy anyway, screaming "Vamos" into the Paris night. "Today I had bad luck because I had a small injury," he said afterward. "But my colleagues do it. They run, they fight. Nobody believed, but we won." Sit with the distance between those two nights for a moment. In 2004, in Lisbon, a teenage Ronaldo cried on a football pitch in defeat in front of a home crowd in a tournament his father, whatever his flaws, was still alive to have watched somewhere on a television hundreds of miles away. In 2016, in Paris, a 31-year-old Ronaldo cried on a football pitch in victory. As a captain who could no longer control the game with his own body, lifting the one trophy that had eluded him with his country for over a decade, his father wasn't alive to see this one. He had been gone for 11 years by then. The man who had first put a football at his son's feet in a small clubhouse in Madeira never got to see that son become a champion for his entire nation. None of those numbers and none of those trophies explain the tears that came next years later, in a very different room with no football pitch anywhere nearby. In a televised interview with Piers Morgan, Ronaldo was shown without warning footage that had apparently never crossed his path before. His father, on camera, speaking with visible pride about the son he had, and about the football career that son was beginning to build. Ronaldo broke down almost instantly. "I never saw the video," he said, staring at the screen. "I never saw that video. Unbelievable." A grown man, one of the most recognizable faces on the planet, reduced in seconds to something rawer and more familiar than any trophy lift. A son discovering, years too late, that his father had been proud of him after all, and had simply never found a way to say it while he was alive to say it. There is a quiet postscript to all of this that Ronaldo himself has shared only once, briefly, almost in passing. He has revealed that he has not returned to his father's grave since the day of the funeral in 2005. Not once, in the 2 decades since, whatever that means, whether it is avoidance or grief too heavy to revisit, or simply a private choice that isn't anyone else's to interpret. It sits uneasily next to a message he posted on social media on a recent Father's Day, alongside an old photograph of the two of them together in Madeira. In Portuguese, he wrote, "Where I come from and who I live for." 4 words carrying 2 directions at once: backward, to a childhood shaped as much by absence as by love, and forward, to everything he has since built for the family that depends on him now. By the time both Ronaldo and Messi had left European football for new leagues on opposite sides of the world, still competing, still aging in front of a public that had watched them for 2 decades, the rivalry itself had quietly softened into something closer to mutual acknowledgement. "The legacy lives on," Ronaldo would say of it, years after the sharpest edges of the competition had dulled. 2 men who had spent 15 years trying to outdo each other had in the end mostly succeeded in making certain neither of them ever had to explain what all that discipline had been for. The numbers already did that. What the numbers couldn't do was explain the argument underneath them. Maybe that is the real, unglamorous truth behind the highlight reels. Cristiano Ronaldo did not become the player he is despite his father. He became that player, in significant part, because of the exact shape of what his father was and was not able to give him: a first taste of football, handed over by a man who could offer little else, a wound that never got the chance to heal into an ordinary conversation, a vow made in grief that hardened over 20 years into one of the most disciplined bodies and careers professional sport has ever produced. 2 nights, 11 years apart, both ending in tears, only one of them witnessed by a father who was still alive to see it. It would be easy to end the story there, with the tears, the video, the grave he has never gone back to visit, but there is a quieter scene worth sitting with too, one with no cameras and no trophy in sight. A man who spent his childhood sharing one small room with 3 siblings, going without, playing barefoot with whatever passed for a ball, now stands in front of his own children with all the resources in the world at his disposal, and by his own account tries mostly to give them something far simpler than wealth: his presence, his time, the sight of him working hard at something every single day so that they never have to wonder whether he means what he says. It is not a dramatic gesture. It is closer to a correction, repeated quietly for years, to something that was missing in his own life before he had any power to fix it. Somewhere, there is still a piece of footage of a man who is no longer alive, saying, in his own words, that he was proud of his son. His son did not get to hear those words in time to answer him. He has spent every day since, in one way or another, still trying to, not by becoming louder or more decorated or harder to ignore, but by making absolutely certain that his own children will never have to wait 20 years and a television interview to find out how their father felt about them. So maybe the real question worth sitting with isn't about goals or records, or who the greatest of all time really is. It's this: is there someone in your own life you're still trying to prove something to? Someone who may never get to see it or hear it or say it back? And if there is, what would you want to say to them, before the chance to say it disappears the way it did for him? And if you are yourself the one someone else is still trying to make proud, have you told them plainly while you still can?